Earlier this evening, I spoke to Alistair Darling. I began by asking him whether the prospect of a Labour victory at Westminster in 2015 might assist the pro-union cause at the referendum in 2014.
Of course, what is happening at the time of the election, the referendum, and I don't just mean the outlook for the next general election, what's happening in the economy, what might be happening in Europe, what might be happening in the Middle East. It's going to influence people. But I think people in Scotland can distinguish between, the election of a government for 5 years, Holyrood or Westminster, and this thing, the referendum, which is about what we have for the next 300 years.
Well, hang on, you're going to have Alex Salmond and the SNP saying, look folks, it's a stark choice between a social democratic Scotland or 5, possibly more, years of Tory austerity, which Labour disagree with as much as we do. That's a no-brainer. Now, surely the only way you can reply to that is to say, look folks, vote no in the referendum campaign because we, Labour, are going to make a social democratic Britain.
Of course, Alex Salmond will fight the issue as against, his government against what you'd like to style a right-wing Thatcher government.
If you're an ordinary voter, surely that is going to have an influence on you.
That will be a real issue at the general election. But the reason he's doing that is because he knows he cannot answer some pretty fundamental questions as to what independence will mean. Now, what I will say, and I continue to say to voters in Scotland, is you are being asked to do something completely different from voting in a government. You are being asked to decide your country should split from the rest of the UK. And you are being asked to do that with some pretty basic questions on what currency will we use, on the European Union.
But it's perfectly reasonable for people here to say, well, yes, we are being asked that question, and yeah, we would actually prefer a social democratic Scotland, not necessarily against being part of Britain, but if the choice is between a political ideology we don't like and an independent Scotland run by an ideology we quite do like, why shouldn't we vote for the latter?
Because you are not voting for 5 years. Remember, in 5 years, time, if you voted for independence, you can't go back to the UK after that. You have changed irrevocably, and that's why of course Alex Salmond does not want to talk about some of the awkward questions of independence. Look at the trouble he got into last autumn of the European Union. No wonder he doesn't want to talk about these things.
You're going to argue.
I'm going to argue that Scotland, its long-term future is dependent upon us being part of the United Kingdom. We're better and stronger because of it. We're part of a larger economy. We can share risks. We can deal with some of the big problems we've got, like the demographic changes that are taking place, the pressures on the welfare state. We're a bigger country than a smaller one, but also the opportunities that we have with Scots firms being able to sell into England without any boundaries, any barriers. The financial services industry. Heavens, they announced yesterday they were just going to use sterling. They wouldn't then have a central bank. They wouldn't have a lender of last resort. What is that doing to the Scottish financial services industry?
You tend to get the sense that there's a sort of assumption, actually, in the coalition that they've kind of won this one. I mean, for example, they've said the other day that they're not going to do any planning for what to do about things like Trident, should Scotland vote to become independent, because they just consider it won't vote that way. And there have been all sorts of political commentators saying that actually in Whitehall they pretty much know they're going to win. Do you think there's a complacency creeping in?
Well, no, I don't. And if there is, there's no place for it. You are 2 years away from the referendum. Nobody can foresee, what's going to happen, how the arguments will pan out. What I do think is that until there is a mandate, and the mandate can only come after the referendum, not before, then you can't just proceed as if somehow the decision had already been taken. Now, we will find out. Presumably in October 2014, when Alex Salmond is good enough to tell us the date, we'll find out what people in Scotland actually think. And until then, of course, we've got to look at these arguments, whether it's on Trident, whether it's on Europe or anything else. Coming back to one of your earlier points, isn't it high time that we actually got onto these things? And you've been talking about the UK government. What about the Scottish government, which cannot tell us until November of this year what it thinks about these things? Okay. Less than a year before the poll, before they're prepared to tell us they're making this proposition. They've had 80 years to think about some of these issues, and they can't answer some fundamental questions. So, ask about the UK government. Also ask the Scottish government. Why can't they tell us?
Now, John Lamont has set up a commission to look at possible further devolution as part of Labour's offering in this debate. Do you think there's any need for more devolution in Scotland?
I think that's a matter of debate. You remember, in 2016...
Well, you say it's a matter of debate.
Well, because the point I'm making is there is no, concluded view or even consensus as to what further devolution is
so you
possible.
Can't think of any more devolved powers that you would be burning to see?
No, I think, and I've said lots of times before, that I suspect that the other things will be devolved from time to time. In 2 years' time, after all, the Scottish Parliament will have to fix its own rate of income tax. It's got powers to start borrowing in another year's time. It's got powers over stamp duty, land tax, if you like. So these things are happening, and that's a change on the 1997 one.
But you can't think of any specific extra form of devolution.
I'm prepared to look at that. What I'm
But hang on. The trouble is, you're running the campaign to stay in the UK. It's not quite good enough to say it's something you're prepared to look at. You're going to have to tell people in Scotland, look, this is either, and it's perfectly legitimate for you to say no, that it simply isn't an important issue, and it shouldn't be an important issue for people in Scotland, or yes, actually, this is what I think.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, and I've always argued this ever since the question of whether you should have a third question or a second question on the ballot paper. The first question you have to ask yourself is: are we staying in the UK? In which case, yes, you do ask yourself whether or not you want to devolve anything further, or are we leaving? In which case, the whole thing is academic.
You are trying to. You're consistently trying to make this into a debate, which I suggest is not the way that many voters, particularly those who've not made up their minds about, will look at. They don't think about this as I've got to make a principled decision about whether or not to be part of the UK, and everything else can wait till later. They want to say, well, hang on. If I'm going to vote no, what are people like Alistair Darling offering by way of further devolution? What are they offering as a positive vision for what might change in the UK? And you just say no. That's a different issue entirely.
Where I disagree with you is, I think the first question you have to ask is, are you staying or are you going? Now, in relation to further devolution, I just make this point: all parties will have to set out in their manifestos what further constitutional change they want, because I don't think you can actually ask people to vote for it if you haven't had something in your manifesto. And at some point, remember, if you go further down the line, you start sharing things like defence. Suppose you decide to do that, you will have to ask people living in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They haven't been asked in any of this so far. I mean, even in the SNP's proposal for a currency union, which now appears to be part, at some point you need to ask whether or not everybody else in the UK wanted to go along with that.
How committed are you to this whole issue? I mean, could we expect to see you standing for the Holyrood Parliament?
Well, I'm still a member of Parliament, and what I'm committed to is fighting this referendum campaign.
Man who's leading, you could say, well, yes, I'd like to be a part of that.
What I do after this referendum campaign, I'll decide then. And try as you might, you're not going to get that out of me tonight.
Now, listen, you're a former Chancellor of the Exchequer. You also, presumably, in the spirit of debate that you said you wanted, concede you might actually lose this campaign. I'm just curious as to what you think. I mean, you've argued that the SNP's idea of having an independent Scotland part of a sterling currency zone is actually a loss of sovereignty for Scotland rather than an increase. What would you suggest? A separate currency? Joining the euro?
Well, what I've said in relation to the currency union is that, if there was independence, there may well be one. All I say to people in Scotland is, if you genuinely think Scotland could go...
But do you think a currency union... I mean, should you lose... Let's say you were the Chancellor of an independent Scotland. What would you say? Would you say you'd be better off from the euro? Or you'd be better off with an independent currency?
Of course it would be desirable to have a currency union, but you also have to understand there are consequences, because a currency union means you've both got to agree your budgets, you've both got to agree on how much you can tax, spend and borrow, and the point I'm making is that's not freedom. That is actually, you imagine, in the Eurozone, when Portugal sits down with Germany to discuss their budget, who's going to make the decisions, who's going to call the shots? And of course, if you decide to separate, a currency union is desirable.
It's the best option.
But do not believe that what I'm drawing attention to is the objectionable terms and conditions, and the fact that no longer will be. This is something that we all agree on. You've got two partners that have to agree Scotland's budget.
Do you think a currency union with Scotland would be in the interests of the United Kingdom?
Of course, if you have independence or separation, of course a currency union is logical. And do you know why? Because a currency union ultimately leads to an economic and then a political union, which is what we've got now. I believe in a political union.
But I just find this very interesting. So you think that actually, should Scotland vote to be independent, you think a currency union with the rest of the UK is preferable to join the euro or having an independent currency, and B, you think it would be in the interest of the rest of the UK, as it would be to have a currency union with Scotland?
Let me answer your question. I don't think it would be in our interest to join the euro, and I can't see that's going to change for some time. I think using somebody else's currency, as I'm now suggesting, with the Bank of England, a foreign bank fixing your interest rates, with no lender of last resort, no central bank, so no one to stand behind our financial institutions, would be mad. That takes you to a currency union, and do you know what? A currency union, as we see in Europe, takes you to an economic union and then ultimately a political union. And guess what? You're back where we are, in the United Kingdom. Why go through all this rigmarole, all this trauma, as the nationalists are suggesting, to end up with the very place that you started out from? So I'm entirely consistent. First of all, I don't want to go through all that, mess, if you like, to ultimately end up, where we started from. But if you're going to do it, of course it's logical to do that, but understand where you end up. You understand your budgets have to be agreed by England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and ultimately you end up with a political union.
Just a last point. We don't have time to get into a big debate about financial regulation, which in independent Scotland, but do you think if Scotland became independent, it would be in the interest of Scotland and in the interest of an organisation like RBS if it became a company registered in the UK rather than here, given the size of the company and the impact of any further problems?
Well, as RBS has said, it would depend on actually what was on the table. If Scotland was part of the European Union, it has to have its own regulator, and that's just what the European laws require. So you'd have a Scottish regulator and you'd have the Bank of England. If you were using somebody else's currency, heaven knows what would happen. Let me just refer you to what Philip Hampton, who's the chairman of RBS, said. He said, we like being in Scotland, we've got good employees, we don't want to move. However, if there's uncertainty, or if people come to doubt who stands behind us, then we'd have to look at it again. Why on earth are we doing this? Why are we putting ourselves through all this? Why do we want to raise in anyone's mind anywhere in the world that might be a question mark over RBS? Or indeed, it doesn't just apply to RBS, the other financial services institutions. People will always ask which bank stands behind you and which government stands behind that bank. That I know from my own experience. When RBS told me they had 3 hours worth of money left, it mattered who stood behind them.
All right, Alistair Darling, thanks very much.
Thank you.